My name is Elena, and for most of my life, I believed I was the luckiest woman in the world. I had a thriving career as a tech consultant, a beautiful home, and what I thought was the most supportive family. My husband, David, was a charming architect who seemed to adore the ground I walked on. My younger sister, Sarah, was my best friend. Or so I thought. Our parents had left us a massive inheritance. But because I was the one who managed the family businesses and grew our wealth, the bulk of the, estate, including our ancestral mansion and a multi-million-dollar trust, was in my name. I took care of everyone. I paid Sarah's debts, funded David's failing firm, and never questioned their loyalty. But everything changed on a rainy Tuesday night. I was driving home from a late meeting when a truck swerved into my lane. The impact was deafening. The last thing I remember was the smell of burning rubber and the cold rain hitting my face. I slipped into a darkness so deep I didn't think I'd ever return. I was in a coma for 8 months. Doctors told my family I might never wake up. To the world, I was a vegetable. But inside that silent prison, something miraculous happened. About 6 months in, I started hearing things. I couldn't move, couldn't open my eyes, but I could hear. And what I heard shattered my soul more than the accident ever could. I heard David and Sarah whispering by my hospital bed. They weren't praying for my recovery. They were complaining that I was taking too long to die. They had already forged my signature on power of attorney documents. They had sold my stocks, emptied my private accounts, and were planning to turn off my life support the moment. The legal paperwork for the final inheritance transfer was cleared. The betrayal was like a physical blade twisting in my chest. My husband and my sister were lovers, and they were building their new life with my blood and sweat while I lay helpless right in front of them. The rage I felt was the only thing that kept my brain from shutting down. I vowed that if I ever opened my eyes, I wouldn't just live, I would become their worst nightmare. The next 2 months were a living hell of forced patience. I lay there, trapped in my own body, listening to David and Sarah mock me. They would come to my room and play the part of the grieving husband and the heartbroken sister whenever a nurse was present. But the moment the door closed, their masks fell off. I heard them laughing about how they had already redecorated my house. Sarah was wearing my expensive jewelry, bragging about how my diamond engagement ring looked better on her finger. David told her he never loved me, that he only married me for the empire my father built. They discussed how they had manipulated my doctors into signing a non-responsive certificate. Every word they spoke was a nail in the coffin of our relationship. But while they were celebrating their victory, I was fighting a war inside my nervous system. I focused every ounce of my will on one thing, my right hand's index finger. Day after day, I tried to send a signal from my brain to that finger. At first there was nothing, just cold, dead silence. But then a flicker, a twitch. I started doing mental exercises, recalling every detail of my secret offshore accounts they didn't know, about the ones protected by biometric scans and complex passwords they couldn't forge. They thought they had drained me dry, but I had a rainy day fund worth millions that was locked behind my own pulse. One afternoon, Sarah came in alone. She leaned over me, her breath smelling of the expensive wine I used to keep in my cellar. She whispered, "Just let go, Elena. David is mine now. The house is mine. You're just a ghost taking up space." She pinched my arm, hard, laughing when I didn't react. That surge of pain was the final spark I needed. My eyes flew open. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just stared at her with a cold, piercing intensity that made her drop her glass. She screamed and ran for the doctors, but I knew the game had changed. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a hunter. Waking up was only the beginning. I had to play the long game. When the doctors rushed in, I pretended to be confused and extremely weak. I made sure David and Sarah thought I had amnesia regarding the weeks leading up to the accident and everything that happened during my coma. I acted like the old Elena, the trusting, loving sister and wife. I watched as their faces turned pale with terror, then shifted into fake joy. David held my hand and cried crocodile tears, saying, "I knew you'd come back to me." I felt like vomiting, but I smiled and whispered, "I missed you too." Over the next few weeks of physical therapy, I regained my strength with a speed that shocked the medical staff. But I kept it a secret from David and Sarah. I told them I was still having blackouts and memory lapses. This gave them a false sense of security. They thought they had time to finish their theft. Meanwhile, I contacted a private investigator and a high-end forensic accountant through a burner phone. I had a loyal nurse buy for me. What they found was staggering. David had used my money to bail his mistress, my sister, out of massive gambling debts. They had even taken out a life insurance policy on me just weeks before the crash. My accident started looking less like a tragedy and more like an attempted murder. I found out the truck driver who hit me was a former employee of David's firm. The rage I felt was now cold and calculated. I didn't just want my money back. I wanted them to suffer the way I had, helpless, alone, and watching everything they love burn to the ground. I began secretly moving the remainder of my hidden assets to an untraceable trust in the Cayman Islands. I was setting the stage for a grand finale that would leave them with nothing but the clothes on their backs in a prison cell. Every time David kissed my forehead, I visualized the handcuffs tightening around his wrists. I was discharged from the hospital, and the celebration they threw at my house was a masterclass in hypocrisy. The house was filled with people I once called friends, most of whom had stayed silent while David and Sarah liquidated my life. I walked through the halls of my own home like a stranger, noticing how they had removed my photos and replaced them with modern art that I hated. Sarah was acting like the lady of the house, giving orders to the staff I had employed for years. I sat in my wheelchair, acting frail, and began my psychological warfare. I started hallucinating during dinner. I would look at Sarah and say, "Did you hear that? It sounds like Dad's voice. He's talking about the secret safe in the basement." I watched Sarah's fork hit her plate. There was no safe in the basement, but I knew her greed would drive her mad. Then I turned to David. David, the truck driver. I remembered his face today. He looked so much like your old foreman, Mike. Isn't that strange? David's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He tried to laugh it off, but I saw his hands shaking. I was planting seeds of paranoia that would grow into a forest. I began making mistakes with our finances in front of them. I told them I had forgotten the password to the primary business account, and that the bank would lock it if we tried again. They were desperate. They needed that money to pay off the predatory lenders they had borrowed from to fund their lifestyle. While I was dying, I watched them whisper in corners, arguing, accusing each other of being sloppy. The bond of love they shared was built on my money, and without it, the cracks were starting to show. Sarah started drinking more, and David started staying out late at the office. They were no longer a team. They were two rats in a cage, and I was the one holding the key. Final phase of my plan began on the anniversary of our parents' death. I invited David and Sarah to the mansion for a special announcement. I told them I was feeling so much better that I wanted to transfer the remaining inheritance to a joint account so we could all be a real family again. You should have seen their eyes. They literally glittered with greed. They thought they had won. They thought I was the same naive Elena who would hand over her life on a silver platter. I had my lawyer, a man who had been my father's closest confidant and the only person I truly trusted, prepare the documents. In reality, these weren't transfer papers. They were detailed confessions and a legal surrender of all their assets to settle the debts they owed to my estate for the fraud they committed while I was in a coma. But to their eyes, they looked like standard bank forms. I told them we needed to celebrate first. I served a vintage wine, the same kind Sarah had bragged about drinking. I sat there, watching them toast to their bright future. I let them sign the papers. The moment the ink dried, my lawyer stepped out from the shadows with two plainclothes detectives. I stood up from my wheelchair, perfectly stable, perfectly strong. The look of pure, unadulterated horror on David's face was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "What is this?" Sarah shrieked, clutching the papers. I walked over to her, took the wine glass from her hand, and poured it over her expensive dress. "This," I said, my voice as cold as the coma I had escaped, "is the end of your fairy tale." "You thought I was sleeping, Sarah?" I was listening. I heard every word. I heard about the jewelry, the truck driver, and the bed you shared with my husband while I was fighting for my life. David tried to scramble for the door, but the detectives were faster. The joint account they thought they were getting was actually a criminal investigation. File. The next few hours were a whirlwind of chaos. The detectives presented David with the evidence of his connection to the truck driver. It turns out David hadn't just hired him. He had promised him a percentage of the life insurance payout. The driver, fearing a life sentence, had already turned state's evidence in exchange for a plea deal. He had recordings of David discussing the accident. David's firm was also investigated and found to be a front for money, laundering, and massive tax evasion. As for Sarah, her world crumbled even faster. Because she had signed the repayment papers, all the jewelry, the cars, and the luxury items she had bought with my money were immediately repossessed. She had nothing. No money, no sister, and no lover. I watched as they were led out in handcuffs, screaming at each other, blaming each other for the failure. Sarah was calling David a loser, and David was shouting that Sarah was the one who pushed him to do it. Their eternal love didn't even last the walk to the police car. I went back inside my house and called a cleaning crew. I wanted every trace of them scrubbed away. Every piece of furniture they touched was sent to a bonfire. Every room they slept in was gutted. I spent the night in my father's old study, looking at the stars, feeling the weight of the last year finally lifting. They had stolen 8 months of my life, but I had taken their entire future. The news of the society scandal hit the headlines the next morning. The woman who came back from the dead to take down her betrayers. I wasn't just Elena the consultant anymore. I was a symbol of justice. But I wasn't done. I wanted to make sure they never saw the sun as free people again. The trial was a media circus. I sat in the front row, dressed in a sharp black suit, looking every bit the powerful CEO I had become. David tried to play the victim, claiming I was unstable and vengeful, but the evidence was undeniable. The forged signatures, the financial trail, and the testimony of the truck driver sealed their fate. David was sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder and financial fraud. Sarah, as an accomplice, received 15 years. When the judge read the sentence, Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, begging for mercy. "Elena, we're blood, please!" I stood up, walked over to the glass partition, and whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "Blood makes us related. Sarah, loyalty makes us family. You stopped being my sister the moment you wished for my death." I turned my back on her and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. I used the remainder of the recovered funds to set up a foundation for coma survivors and victims of domestic financial abuse. I wanted my pain to serve a purpose. My story wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclamation. I reclaimed my name, my fortune, and my soul. I moved back into the mansion, but it felt different now. It was filled with light and new energy. I hired Mark's old staff back, and they welcomed me with tears of joy. I realized that while I had lost a husband and a sister, I had gained a level of strength I never knew I possessed. I was no longer afraid of the dark, because I had lived in it and found my way back. A year has passed since the trial. I am standing on the balcony of my home watching the sunset. Life is quiet now, but it's a beautiful kind of quiet. I've sold the family business and started a new venture in venture capital, focusing on ethical businesses. I've even started dating again, a kind, grounded man who doesn't know the full extent of my past, and I like it that way. I am no longer defined by the accident or the betrayal. I am defined by my resilience. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I think about David and Sarah in their cold cells, and I wonder if they ever think about me. Do they regret what they did? Or do they just regret getting caught? It doesn't matter. Their lives are a closed chapter in a book I've already finished. I look at my reflection in the glass door. The scars on my body from the accident are still there, faint lines of silver against my skin. They used to remind me of my weakness, but now they are my medals of honor. I survived a truck, a coma, and a conspiracy. I am Elena, the woman who woke up. To anyone out there who feels like they are in their own kind of coma, trapped in a toxic relationship, silenced by those they love, or buried under the weight of betrayal, know this: your voice still exists. Your strength is still there. Wait for your moment, find your spark, and when you wake up, don't just survive, rise. The world is waiting for your return, and the dawn is more beautiful than you can ever imagine. The end of my story is just the beginning of my life.